She was gone. Just vanished. I ran up and down the neighborhood, calling her name, my voice breaking with every shout. Lucy was due any day now, and she had never run off before. My heart pounded as I searched every possible hiding place, every street corner, every yard, but there was no sign of her. It had been a chilly October morning when I'd last seen Lucy, my golden retriever. She was stretched out on the porch, her belly round and full of life, her tail wagging lazily as I rubbed behind her ears. I had gone inside for just a moment, long enough to pour myself a cup of coffee. When I came back out, she was gone. I called my neighbors, knocked on doors, and even enlisted my friend Mark, who worked at the local animal shelter, to help me search. We scoured the wooded trails behind my house, checked the park, and even asked the delivery drivers if they had seen a pregnant golden retriever wandering around. Nothing. Hours turned into a full day, then 2, then 3. The days dragged on, each one filled with worry. My mom tried to reassure me, saying Lucy was strong and smart. "She'll come back when she's ready," she told me. But how could she just disappear right before giving birth? On the 5th morning, I had barely slept. My body ached from searching, and my mind was filled with worst-case scenarios. Then, just as I was stepping onto the porch with my coffee, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft whimper coming from the trees behind the house. I bolted down the steps, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible. "Lucy?" My voice trembled as I followed the sound, pushing through thick bushes and damp grass. Then I saw her. She was lying beneath an old oak tree, her golden fur dirty and tangled. My breath caught in my throat as I took in the sight. She wasn't alone. Nestled beside her, huddled together, were tiny newborn puppies. More than I could count at first glance. They squirmed and whimpered, pressing against their mother's warm body. My hands shook as I knelt beside her. "Oh, Lucy," I whispered, stroking her head. She lifted her tired eyes to me and let out a soft sigh. Relief washed over me, but confusion lingered. Where had she been? And why had she chosen this spot to give birth? Mark arrived a few minutes later after I called him, his truck kicking up dust as he pulled into the driveway. He jumped out, eyes wide when he saw Lucy and her litter. "How many?" he asked, crouching beside me. I counted again. 9. 9 tiny puppies. Mark let out a low whistle. "She must have known she needed somewhere safe. Maybe instinct took over." I nodded, my hand never leaving Lucy's fur. "But why out here? She had a warm bed inside." Lucy nuzzled one of her puppies, licking its tiny head. It was then that I noticed something else. Something that made my stomach flip. A second dog lay just a few feet away. A small, wiry-haired mutt curled up protectively beside Lucy's pups. It lifted its head slightly, watching me with wary eyes. Mark noticed too. "Well, now that's interesting," he muttered. "Looks like Lucy wasn't alone out here." I had never seen this dog before. Its ribs showed slightly beneath its scruffy coat, and its ears twitched nervously. But there was something in its eyes, something almost grateful. Lucy gave a soft whine and licked the little dog's face. My heart swelled at the sight. Whatever had happened in the days she had been gone, she hadn't just found a place to give birth. She had found a friend. I reached out slowly, my fingers grazing the scruffy dog's fur. It flinched, but didn't pull away. "You stayed with her, didn't you?" I whispered. Mark let out a breath. "Looks like it." We carried Lucy and her puppies back to the house, placing them gently in the soft bed I had prepared. The little stray hesitated at the door, watching cautiously. I patted the blanket. "Come on, you're part of this now." The dog took a tentative step forward, then another, finally curling up beside Lucy once more. I could feel something shift in my chest. Something warm. Something hopeful. Whatever had happened out there, whatever strange journey Lucy had taken, it had brought her back. And she hadn't come back alone. As I sat beside them, watching tiny paws stretch and wiggle, I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of something special. Days passed, and Lucy settled in with her puppies, nursing them carefully and keeping them close. The little stray, whom I started calling Scruff, never left her side. He was gentle with the puppies, nudging them when they squeaked and lying protectively near them when Lucy rested. Mark came by regularly to check on them, making sure Lucy was eating well and gaining her strength back. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, sipping lemonade, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You ever think about keeping that little guy?" he asked, nodding toward Scruff. I had thought about it a lot. He was still wary, but he had warmed up to me more each day. He had started wagging his tail when I came outside, and even let me scratch behind his ears. "I don't know," I admitted. "He might belong to someone." "We can check around," Mark said. "But if no one comes forward, I think you've got yourself another dog." I looked over at Scruff, who was now curled up beside Lucy and her puppies, his eyes half closed in the afternoon sun. Something in my heart told me that he had already decided where he belonged. Over the next few weeks, I put up flyers and checked with the shelter, but no one claimed Scruff. By the time Lucy's puppies started wobbling around on shaky legs, I knew he wasn't going anywhere. He was part of the family now. One by one, the puppies found homes. Families came to see them, their faces lighting up at the sight of the wiggling tails and tiny paws. I made sure each one went to someone who would love them as much as I did. And then, finally, it was just Lucy, Scruff, and me. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the two of them chase each other around the yard, I couldn't help but smile. Lucy had been through so much, but she had come back stronger. And she had brought a friend who needed a home just as much as she had. Sometimes, life had a way of leading you exactly where you needed to be. The crisp autumn air carried a soft rustling through the trees as Lucy and Scruff sat side by side, watching over the last remaining pup that hadn't yet found a home. The tiny, golden-furred ball of energy had been the runt of the litter, but he had grown stronger with each passing day. I had named him Tucker, and though several families had expressed interest, something held me back from letting him go just yet. Mark pulled up in his truck, stepping out with a small bag in his hand. "Brought some more puppy food. Figured you might need it," he said, grinning. "Still can't part with Tucker, huh?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know, Mark. He just feels like he belongs here. Like Scruff, I guess." Scruff, as if understanding, nudged Tucker playfully, earning a tiny yip of excitement. Lucy wagged her tail, keeping a watchful eye on the two. It was hard to deny that the little pup had already carved out his place in the family. "You know," Mark said, leaning against the porch railing, "sometimes the right home isn't somewhere else. Sometimes it's right where they started." That thought stuck with me. That evening, as I sat with Lucy, Scruff, and Tucker curled up by my side, I realized I had already made my decision. Tucker wasn't going anywhere. As the days passed, Scruff and Lucy became inseparable, their bond growing stronger. It amazed me how they had found each other in the woods and formed an unshakable connection. Scruff had once been cautious and hesitant around me, but now he greeted me with excited tail wags and even nudged my hand for attention. He had gone from a frightened stray to a loving companion, and every time I saw him protectively watching over Tucker, my heart swelled. One afternoon, as I was raking leaves in the backyard, I noticed Lucy sniffing the air, her ears perked. She let out a low, curious whimper before trotting toward the fence. Scruff followed, his body tense but not fearful. Something had caught their attention. I dropped the rake and walked over, peering beyond the fence into the woods. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then a movement among the trees caught my eye. A figure, small and skittish, darted behind a tree. "Is that?" I trailed off, stepping closer. It was another dog. Thin, with matted fur, and watching us with wide, uncertain eyes. Scruff let out a short, quiet bark, not in warning but in recognition. My heart clenched. Had Scruff known this dog? Had they been strays together before Lucy found him? Lucy's tail wagged slightly, and she lay down in the grass, making herself look as unthreatening as possible. Scruff did the same. I followed their lead, crouching down and extending my hand. "Hey there, buddy," I murmured softly. "You don't have to be afraid." The dog hesitated, eyes darting between us. I could see the ribs protruding through his thin coat, and it made my chest tighten. He was just like Scruff had been when Lucy first brought him home, starving, scared, and alone. Tucker, curious as ever, wobbled forward, letting out an excited yip. The stranger's ears twitched at the sound, and for a moment it seemed like he was considering coming closer. Minutes passed. I stayed as still as possible, waiting. Then, cautiously, the dog took a step forward. Then another. And another. I held my breath as he reached the fence, sniffing hesitantly before looking up at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope. "It's okay," I whispered. "You're safe here." And just like that, the journey we thought had ended took another unexpected turn. Lucy had returned with Scruff, and now Scruff had brought another soul in need of love and a home. The family was growing again, and I couldn't help but wonder, how many more lives would find their way to us before this story truly ended? The new arrival, whom I tentatively named Jack, was skittish at first. He would eat, but only from a distance. He flinched at sudden movements and watched us with careful, wary eyes. But Scruff was patient. He would sit near Jack, not crowding him, just offering silent companionship. And Lucy? She treated him like she had Scruff. Gentle, reassuring, never forcing anything. Over the next few days, Jack slowly began to trust us. He still wouldn't come inside, but he'd sleep by the porch, curled up on an old blanket I'd placed there. Tucker, ever the fearless pup, seemed determined to win him over, bounding toward him with excited yips and puppy clumsiness. Jack would tense, then cautiously sniff at him, as if trying to make sense of this tiny ball of energy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I sat outside, watching the dogs interact. Scruff was lying beside Jack, occasionally licking his ear, while Lucy nursed Tucker, keeping a watchful eye on both. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. Mark stopped by again, leaning against his truck as he took in the sight. "Looks like you're running a full house," he joked, crossing his arms. I chuckled, shaking my head. "I never planned on this, but I can't turn them away." He nodded, watching Jack for a long moment. "Some dogs find their way to the right people, and some people find their way to the right dogs." As if to prove his point, Jack did something unexpected. He stretched, yawned, then slowly got up and padded over to me. He hesitated for only a moment before nudging his head under my hand. My throat tightened. "Hey, buddy," I murmured, stroking his head gently. His fur was rough, but beneath the tangles and dirt, I could feel the warmth of trust forming. Mark clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Looks like you've got another keeper." I glanced down at Jack, who had settled beside me, his tail giving a hesitant wag. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe I had just gained another family member. As the cool autumn night settled in, I realized something. My home had changed. It wasn't just me and Lucy anymore. It wasn't even just Scruff or Tucker. It was all of them. Lucy, Scruff, Tucker, and now Jack. A mismatched pack brought together not by blood, but by something even stronger. Love. Trust. A second chance. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The first morning Jack finally stepped inside the house was an unforgettable one. It wasn't a grand event, not a dramatic leap through the door, but a slow, hesitant shuffle. I had left the door open as usual, hoping he'd work up the courage, and when I glanced over my shoulder from the kitchen, there he was, standing in the doorway. His paws barely grazed the wooden floor, his body tensed, as if any moment might send him running back outside. But he was in, even if just for a second. Lucy, curled up in her bed, lifted her head and gave a single slow wag of her tail. Scruff was sprawled out beside her, and even Tucker, who had been gnawing on a rubber chew toy, stopped to look. It was as if they all sensed the importance of this moment. I held my breath, watching Jack's gaze dart around the room, his nose twitching as he took in the scents of home. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let him decide. Then, in one fluid motion, Jack took another step inside. I exhaled, not realizing I had been holding my breath. He had done it. He had chosen to trust us. He still wasn't ready to be touched, but that was okay. It had taken weeks to get him this far. I let him be, and before long, he curled up near the entrance of the room, watching the others but no longer separating himself. Progress. Mark came by later that afternoon, carrying a fresh bag of kibble. He raised an eyebrow as soon as he spotted Jack on the floor. "Well, would you look at that?" he said. "Seems like he's finally figured out where he belongs." I grinned. Took him long enough. Jack's journey was far from over. He still flinched when I moved too quickly, still preferred to eat with his back against the wall, still eyed the door as if unsure he could truly stay. But every day, he let himself relax a little more. One evening, as I sat on the couch reading, I felt something warm press against my leg. I glanced down and froze. It was Jack. He had moved from his usual spot by the door and had settled against me. His fur was still rough, and his body was still stiff with uncertainty, but he was here. I barely breathed as I slowly reached out, brushing my fingers gently over his head. And then it happened. Jack leaned into my touch. It was slight, barely noticeable, but it was there. A silent acceptance. A trust he had given only when he was ready. Life carried on. The days turned colder, and the nights grew longer. Tucker, now stronger and bursting with energy, had taken to zooming around the house at all hours, much to Scruff's mild annoyance. Lucy remained the matriarch of the group, watching over them all with unwavering patience. Jack, once the outsider, had settled into his place among them. Then, as if fate hadn't had enough surprises for us, something new happened. One evening, as I stepped out onto the porch, I heard it. The faintest whimper coming from the woods. My stomach tightened. It was a sound I had heard before. The same sound that had led me to Lucy when she had gone missing. The same sound that had brought Scruff into our lives. I turned, my breath clouding in the cold air. Scruff and Jack had already noticed. Both were standing at the edge of the yard, ears perked, eyes locked on the tree line. I hesitated only a moment before grabbing a flashlight and stepping off the porch. The familiar crunch of leaves beneath my boots sent a shiver through me, but I pushed forward. The sound came again, a soft, desperate cry. Scruff and Jack moved beside me, their presence steadying my nerves. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees. Then I saw it. A shape curled up against the base of an old fallen log. A dog, smaller than Jack, thinner than Scruff had been. Her fur was muddied, clumped in places, and she barely lifted her head as I approached. But the moment our eyes met, I knew. She had been waiting for someone to find her. I crouched down, whispering softly. Jack took the lead, stepping forward first, lowering his head in the same way Scruff had done for him. There was a silence that passed between them, an understanding. The little dog gave a shuddering sigh, and ever so slowly reached out a trembling paw. My heart clenched. Scruff gave a low, reassuring whine, and Jack, proving just how far he had come, gently nudged the little dog's nose. A silent promise. You're safe now. I reached out, my fingers grazing her damp fur. She didn't flinch, she didn't run. She just closed her eyes and let herself be found. Bringing her home wasn't as simple as carrying her inside. She was weak, so frail that I was afraid she might not make it through the night. I wrapped her in a soft blanket, her tiny body barely weighing anything in my arms. Scruff and Jack followed closely as I brought her inside. Lucy lifted her head from her spot on the couch, her eyes immediately locking onto the new arrival. Tucker, who had been dozing beside her, stretched his tiny legs and yawned before waddling over to investigate. Mark arrived not long after, bringing medical supplies and warm broth. "She's in rough shape," he murmured as he checked her over. "But she's a fighter. She just needs time." We named her Millie. It was a name that fit her, delicate but strong. The first few days were difficult. She barely ate, barely moved, but Scruff and Jack never left her side. They curled around her at night, keeping her warm, letting her know she wasn't alone. Lucy stood watch from a distance, her maternal instincts kicking in. Then, one morning, a tiny breakthrough. Millie lifted her head and licked my hand. My throat tightened. It was the smallest gesture, but it meant everything. She was choosing to trust, just like Jack had, just like Scruff had before him. Weeks passed, and Millie's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. She gained weight, her once dull eyes now full of light. She started playing with Tucker, chasing him around the yard with newfound energy. She even let me brush her fur, something she had shied away from at first. Mark watched from the porch one evening, shaking his head with a smile. "You know," he said, "I think you might have a habit of collecting strays." I laughed, scratching Scruff behind the ears. "Maybe," I admitted, "but I think they found me first." As I looked at the growing family around me, I knew this was exactly where I was meant to be. And somehow, I had a feeling our story wasn't done yet. The first snow of the season arrived quietly in the night, blanketing the yard in soft white. I woke to the sight of Lucy and Scruff playing in it, their golden and brown coats speckled with frost as they chased each other through the drifts. Tucker, now growing fast, hopped clumsily after them, his little paws kicking up powdery bursts of snow with every bound. Jack and Millie stayed by the porch, watching, still hesitant about the unfamiliar cold, but curious enough to sit and observe. I stepped outside, my boots crunching against the fresh snow. Jack lifted his head to watch me, his tail giving a hesitant wag. Millie pressed against his side, comforted by his warmth. It had only been a few weeks since she had come into our lives, and though she was no longer the frail, frightened dog we had found, she still had her moments of hesitation. But Jack's presence had done wonders for her. He had become her protector, just as Scruff had been his. Mark arrived later that morning, a thick wool coat wrapped around him, carrying a bag of supplies. "Brought some more food and a few blankets," he said, setting them down by the door. "Looks like winter's finally here." I nodded, glancing at the sky. "They seem to love it," I said, gesturing to Lucy and Scruff, who were still romping in the snow. Tucker had finally tackled Scruff, the older dog playfully rolling onto his back, letting the pup think he had won the battle. Mark chuckled. "That little one's got some spirit." I turned my attention back to Jack and Millie. "She's doing better," I said. "Still cautious, but I think she's getting there." Mark knelt down, extending his hand toward Millie, who watched him with those deep, intelligent eyes of hers. She didn't flinch this time. Instead, she sniffed his hand, then, to my surprise, gave it a tiny lick. "Well, I'll be," Mark murmured. "She's coming around faster than I thought." I smiled, warmth spreading through my chest. It was small victories like these that made all the difference. As the days passed, the dogs adjusted to the cold, and I made sure they had a warm place to sleep inside each night. Tucker had taken to burrowing under the blankets on the couch, and Scruff had claimed his usual spot beside the fireplace. Jack and Millie, still wary of closed spaces, stayed near the door, but no longer insisted on sleeping outside. It was progress, and I wasn't going to rush them. One morning, as I was sipping my coffee, watching the dogs play through the window, I noticed something unusual. Jack had stopped in the middle of the yard, ears perked, staring at the tree line. Millie was beside him, her body tensed. I stepped outside, following their gaze. "What is it?" I asked softly. Jack let out a low growl, not aggressive, but cautious. Then I saw it. Movement in the trees, a shape dark against the snow. It was a dog, larger than any of the ones we had found before. It stood just at the edge of the trees, watching us, its posture unsure. Lucy had noticed now, too, her tail lowering slightly, but she didn't bark. She simply stood beside Jack and Millie, waiting. I took a step forward. "Hey there," I called gently. The dog didn't move. It was thin, though not as malnourished as Millie had been. Its coat was dark brown, almost black, and its eyes glowed amber in the morning light. There was intelligence there. Caution. Scruff, ever the diplomat, trotted forward a few steps, his tail wagging in slow, friendly sweeps. The strange dog watched him, but didn't retreat. That was a good sign. Mark had stepped outside now, too, standing beside me. "Another one?" he murmured. "Seems that way," I replied, keeping my voice soft. "But this one's different. He's not running." We stood there, waiting, the cold air swirling around us. The new dog hesitated, then took a tentative step forward. Jack, to my surprise, was the first to react. He didn't move aggressively, didn't bark. Instead, he gave a single, quiet whine and lowered his head slightly. A sign of peace. The dark dog's ears twitched. Another step. Then another. I held my breath, as he finally crossed the boundary from the woods to the yard. His body tense, but his eyes locked onto Jack's. Jack let out another soft whine, and after a moment, the new dog mirrored it. They knew each other. My stomach twisted with realization. This wasn't just another stray. Jack had a past before he found his way to us, and now it had found him again. Millie, always one to follow Jack's lead, took a hesitant step closer, sniffing at the air. The dark dog's tail gave a single flick. Then, before I could even process what was happening, he did something I never expected. He lay down. Right there in the snow, he lowered himself, body stretched out, head resting on his paws. A gesture of trust, of submission. Jack walked forward slowly, then sniffed at him, tail wagging ever so slightly. Mark let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like Jack's got some history we don't know about." I nodded, my heart pounding. And it just walked right back into his life. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The dark dog remained lying in the snow, unmoving except for the rise and fall of his breath. Jack had settled beside him, not pressing too close, but staying near enough that their presence together felt intentional. Millie crept forward next, cautiously sniffing at the new arrival before backing away to Jack's side. The others kept their distance, watching, waiting. I took slow, careful steps toward them, not wanting to startle the newcomer. "Hey there, buddy," I said softly. "You're okay." The dog's ears twitched at my voice, but he didn't move. His amber eyes flicked toward me, assessing, wary but not fearful. He was making a choice, trying to decide whether he should trust me. Jack let out a quiet whine and nudged the dog's side. It was the first real movement he had made since approaching the house. The dark dog sighed, then slowly, deliberately, pushed himself up into a sitting position. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That was a good sign. Mark, who had been standing nearby with his arms crossed, took a step forward. "Seems like he's not just another stray," he murmured. "There's something about him, like he's been looking for something, or someone." I nodded, my gaze locked on the dog as he looked back at Jack. The familiarity between them was unmistakable. This wasn't a random meeting. There was history here. I crouched down and extended my hand, palm up. "You don't have to be scared," I said. "If you're with Jack, you're safe." The dog hesitated. His nose twitched, scenting the air, his muscles still tense, ready to bolt if needed. But then Jack did something unexpected. He pressed his nose against my outstretched palm, before turning back to the new dog and nudging him again. A reassurance. A signal that I could be trusted. The dark dog let out a long, slow exhale. Then, ever so carefully, he leaned forward and pressed his nose to my hand. Relief flooded through me. "There we go," I murmured. "Good boy." He pulled back almost instantly, still cautious, still uncertain, but the fact that he had taken that step meant everything. I didn't rush him. I just stayed there, letting him take in the surroundings, letting him see that he wasn't in danger here. Scruff finally took a few steps closer, tail wagging in a slow, relaxed rhythm. He had always been the mediator of the group, the one who had welcomed both Jack and Millie. He stopped a few feet away and sat down, waiting. The new dog turned his gaze toward Scruff, his ears still pinned back, but there was no aggression in his posture, only uncertainty. Lucy, still watching from a distance, finally stood and shook out her fur before trotting toward us. She was confident, calm, her maternal nature evident in the way she carried herself. The new dog's eyes followed her approach, and for the first time, His tail gave a tiny, almost imperceptible wag. "Well, I'll be damned," Mark muttered. "I think he's figuring it out." It took time. He didn't immediately settle in the way Jack had, nor did he warm up as quickly as Millie. But he stayed. That was what mattered. That night, as the snow continued to fall, I set up a spot for him in the garage. It was warm, with plenty of blankets and a bowl of food nearby. He hesitated at the threshold, glancing at Jack as if seeking permission. Jack gave a small bark, then stepped inside first. That was all it took. The dark dog followed, curling up in the blankets beside Jack, his body still tense, but no longer on edge. Mark watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "You're really building a whole pack, huh?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "I didn't plan for this, but I can't turn them away." Mark nodded. "You gonna name him?" I looked at the dark dog, who was watching me now, his amber eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place yet. "Not until he tells me who he is," I said. "But we'll figure it out." The days passed, and the dark dog, whom I started calling Shadow in my head, though I wasn't sure it fit yet, began adjusting. He still flinched when I moved too quickly, still hesitated to take food directly from my hand, but he stayed. Jack never left his side. It was as if he understood that Shadow needed the same kind of patience and reassurance that had been given to him. He showed him how to approach the porch without fear, how to eat with the others without feeling like he had to defend himself. One morning, I woke to the sound of paws padding across the wooden floor. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and saw Shadow standing in the doorway to the living room. Inside. Jack was beside him, looking back as if waiting for permission to go farther. Shadow hesitated, then took a step in. Then another, and then, just like Jack had done weeks ago, he crossed the threshold and lay down near the couch. Lucy, who had been dozing nearby, lifted her head and looked at him. Then, after a moment, she got up, walked over, and lay down beside him. Acceptance. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Later that afternoon, as I sat outside with Mark, watching the dogs play in the snow, he nudged my shoulder. "Look at that." I turned my gaze toward the yard. Shadow was chasing Tucker, his movements hesitant at first, but as Tucker yipped excitedly and doubled back, Shadow let out what could only be described as a laugh. His tail wagged, really wagged, for the first time. "He's home now," I said quietly. Mark smiled. "Yeah, I think he knows it too." I leaned back, watching the pack, because that's what they were now, running through the snow. Shadow had found his place. And something told me there was still more to come. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the cold deepened. Snowdrifts lined the fences, and the trees stood heavy with frost. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace cast a golden glow across the wooden floors, and the soft sound of breathing filled the room. Lucy was curled up on her usual spot near the couch, her head resting on her paws. Scruff stretched out nearby, his body rising and falling in peaceful slumber. Tucker, the smallest but most energetic, twitched in his sleep, lost in the excitement of whatever dream played behind his closed eyes. But my focus was on Shadow. He lay near the entrance to the living room, body curled, but his eyes open. He had been with us for a few weeks now, and though he had made remarkable progress, there were still nights like this. Nights where he couldn't quite settle, Nights where his past still clung to him. Jack was awake too, sitting near Shadow, but not crowding him. He had taken it upon himself to be Shadow's silent guardian, never forcing him to do anything but always being near when he needed it. Tonight was no different. I watched as Jack inched closer and lay down beside him, their fur brushing just slightly. Shadow sighed, his body softening just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. I leaned back in my chair, watching them, knowing that trust wasn't something that could be rushed. Shadow had been hurt before, that much was clear. He had been alone. And now he was learning what it meant to have a place where he was safe. The next morning, the world outside was a frozen wonderland. Ice clung to the tree branches, and the snow stretched in thick, endless blankets. The dogs were eager to get outside, their excitement clear as they bounded through the drifts, kicking up clouds of powder. Even Shadow, though hesitant, followed Jack and Scruff into the yard, his dark fur standing in contrast against the blinding white. Mark arrived just as the dogs were playing, stepping out of his truck with a grin. "They sure don't mind the cold, do they?" I laughed. "Not at all. I think Tucker would stay out there all day if I let him." Mark watched for a moment before turning serious. "I checked around town again. Still no reports of a missing dog that matches Shadow." I nodded. I had suspected as much. Whoever he had belonged to before, they weren't looking for him. Or maybe he had never had anyone looking for him at all. "Then I guess he's where he needs to be." Mark clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You've got a real way with these dogs, you know." I shrugged, watching as Shadow cautiously approached Tucker, who had flopped onto his back in the snow in an invitation to play. "I just give them time." Shadow hesitated, then, after a long pause, lowered himself and placed a paw on Tucker's belly. The little pup yipped with joy, twisting around and nipping playfully. Shadow's tail gave a single, hesitant wag. Mark chuckled. "That's the first time I've seen him play." I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire inside. "Yeah," I said softly. "He's starting to believe this is home." The winter days passed in a peaceful routine. The dogs played outside during the day and curled up near the fire at night. Jack and Shadow became nearly inseparable, their quiet bond growing stronger with each day. Millie had started to mirror Lucy's calm demeanor, taking on a protective role over Tucker, who remained the energetic force of the group. But even as things settled, I knew there was still more to Shadow's story. He had come to us on his own, but something told me his past wasn't entirely behind him yet. One evening, as I was bringing in wood for the fire, a sound in the distance made me stop. A howl, low and distant, echoed through the trees. The dogs heard it too. Lucy's ears perked, and Scruff lifted his head. Jack and Shadow both stood still, their bodies tense. I waited, listening. The howl came again, closer this time. Mark, who had just arrived, narrowed his eyes. "That's not a coyote." I shook my head. "No, it's a dog." Shadow had gone completely still, his amber eyes locked on the darkness beyond the fence. And then, before I could stop him, he bolted. "Shadow!" I called, dropping the firewood and running after him. Jack followed immediately, his loyalty unwavering. The others barked, but they stayed back, knowing this chase was different. Shadow moved fast, his body cutting through the snow like a ghost. I pushed forward, my boots crunching against the frozen ground, my breath coming in sharp bursts. The trees blurred around me as I followed his dark shape through the woods. Then, up ahead, a figure emerged from the shadows. Another dog. Bigger than Shadow, with fur that was a mixture of black and gray. His stance was strong, but not aggressive. His eyes locked onto Shadow's, and in that instant I knew. This was someone from Shadow's past. Jack slowed beside me, his ears forward but his body relaxed. Shadow, however, was stiff, his tail low but not tucked. The other dog didn't move, didn't growl. He just stood there, watching, waiting. I swallowed hard, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Shadow," I said quietly. "Who is he?" Shadow turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at me, and in his eyes I saw the answer before I even needed to hear it. This wasn't just another stray. This was someone who had been searching for him, and Shadow had finally been found. The silence between them stretched long, charged with a tension I couldn't place. The larger dog took a step forward, his head lowering slightly but not in submission, more like recognition. Shadow stiffened, but didn't back away. Jack, sensing the shift, stayed close, but didn't intervene. This was Shadow's moment. I moved slowly, careful not to startle either of them. "Shadow," I called softly. "Is he someone you know?" Shadow's tail gave the smallest flick, almost unnoticeable, but it was enough. The larger dog whined, stepping forward again before stopping, as if waiting for permission. Shadow hesitated for another long moment before, finally, he took a step closer. Then another, and another. They met in the middle, noses brushing, a silent exchange of something deep and unspoken. The larger dog licked Shadow's ear, a gesture of familiarity. And just like that, the tension broke. Jack exhaled beside me, his body relaxing as Shadow finally pressed his head against the larger dog's shoulder. Whoever this was, they had been through something together. And now, fate had brought them back. Mark let out a low whistle. Guess we just found another piece of Shadow's past. I nodded. Or maybe it found him. The fire had burned down to embers by the time I returned to the house, my boots still wet from the snow. Lucy raised her head as I entered, her tail wagging lazily before she settled back into her warm spot near the hearth. Scruff stirred, but didn't open his eyes, while Tucker's soft, rhythmic breathing told me he was deep in sleep. Jack, as usual, lay close to the door, his body a comforting presence for Shadow, who now rested beside him. And then there was the newcomer. The large, dark dog lay curled up a few feet away from Shadow, his breathing even and calm. It was the first time I'd seen him completely relaxed since he'd emerged from the woods earlier that night. I still didn't know what to call him, but I knew he belonged here now, just as much as the others. I crouched down near Jack and Shadow, careful not to startle them. "Looks like your friends decided to stay," I said softly. Jack opened one eye, his tail thumping once on the floor, while Shadow let out a low, contented sigh. Over the next few days, the pack settled into their new routine. The dark dog, whom I started calling Titan for his sheer size, followed Shadow almost everywhere, their bond clear in the way they moved together. Jack accepted him without question, and even Lucy treated Titan with the calm authority of a seasoned leader. Tucker, ever curious, took to following Titan around the yard, his little legs working overtime to keep up. Millie watched from a distance at first, but as the days passed, she grew comfortable enough to join their games, her own playful side beginning to shine. Mark came by on the third morning, his truck kicking up a trail of snow as he pulled into the driveway. "Got something for you?" he called out, holding up a battered collar and a bag of treats. "Found this in the back of the shelter. Thought it might fit your big guy." I took the collar from him, turning it over in my hands. It was well worn, the leather softened by years of use. Thanks, I said. He's still settling in, but I think he'll like it. As if on cue, Titan trotted over, his ears perked. I knelt down and gently slipped the collar around his neck. He stood still, letting me adjust it before nudging my hand with his nose. Good boy, I murmured, giving him a scratch behind the ears. His tail wagged once, then twice, a rare show of emotion from the stoic giant. Mark leaned against the porch railing, watching as the dogs romped through the snow. You ever think about how all this happened? He asked after a moment. I glanced at him, unsure what he meant. What do you mean? He nodded toward the pack. Lucy, Scruff, Jack, Millie, Shadow, and now Titan. None of them were supposed to end up here, and yet they did. It's like they were all meant to find this place, and each other. I turned back to the dogs, watching as Tucker pounced on a stick that Titan held firmly in his jaws. Shadow hovered nearby, his posture relaxed for once, while Lucy and Millie kept a watchful eye on the playful chaos. I don't know if it's fate or just luck, I said after a while, but I can't imagine this place without them now. Mark nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Maybe you're right. The rest of that day passed quietly, the sound of paws crunching through snow and occasional happy barks filling the crisp air. I found myself thinking about what Mark had said. It was true that none of this had been planned. Lucy had been the start of it all, and one by one they had come. Scruff, Jack, Millie, Shadow, and now Titan. Each of them had a story, a past, and somehow they had all ended up here. But I also knew that their stories weren't finished. Shadow's past had walked out of the woods in the form of Titan, and while Shadow had accepted him, there were still unanswered questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that Titan had brought more than just his presence. He had brought a piece of Shadow's old life, something I didn't fully understand yet. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of indigo, I sat by the fire with the pack around me. Titan lay near the door, his massive body stretched out, while Shadow rested beside him. Jack was curled up at my feet, his tail twitching in his sleep. Lucy and Millie shared a blanket near the hearth, and Tucker, ever the smallest, ever the boldest, had claimed the armchair for himself, his tiny form barely taking up a corner of the cushion. I stared into the flames, thinking about the journey that had brought us all together. It wasn't just about where they had come from, it was about where we were all going, and as I watched the firelight dance across their fur, I felt a deep sense of purpose. There was more to come. I could feel it. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the kind of day that made every breath visible in the icy air. The pack was already up and moving, their energy unbounded as they raced through the snow. Even Titan, who had seemed so cautious when he first arrived, was now fully part of the pack. He chased Tucker with a surprising lightness for a dog of his size, his deep bark blending with Tucker's sharp yips as they weaved through the trees at the edge of the yard. Jack and Shadow, as always, stayed close to each other. Their bond had deepened with Titan's presence, as though his arrival had solidified something between them. Shadow seemed more at ease now, his posture looser, his eyes brighter. And while he still had his quiet, pensive moments, it was clear he was settling into his new life. As I watched them play, I thought about what Mark had said. None of them were supposed to be here. None of them were part of some grand plan. But here they were, and it felt right. It felt like they belonged. I had never set out to create a pack, never imagined my home would become a refuge for these dogs. But now I couldn't picture my life without them. Mark arrived mid-morning, a large bag of dog food slung over his shoulder. He greeted the pack with a whistle, laughing as Tucker sprinted toward him, tail wagging furiously. "How's the big guy doing?" he asked, nodding toward Titan. "Better than I expected," I said. "He's starting to trust me more. Even lets me brush him now." Mark grinned. "That's a good sign. He's a good dog, just needed the right place." As we carried the food inside, I couldn't help but ask, "Do you think it's fate? That they all ended up here?" Mark paused, looking out at the yard where the dogs were still playing. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just a coincidence. Either way, it's a pretty special thing you've got here." The rest of the day passed in a comfortable rhythm. I worked on some repairs around the house while the pack roamed the yard, their playful barks filling the air. Shadow stayed close to Titan, their bond as evident as ever. Jack, always the peacemaker, kept things balanced, making sure everyone felt included. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep orange, I sat by the fire again. This time, the pack gathered closer, drawn by the warmth and the sense of safety it provided. Titan lay beside me, his head resting on my knee. Shadow was curled up against Jack, their breathing synchronized in a way that spoke of deep trust. Lucy and Millie shared their usual spot near the hearth, while Tucker dozed on the armchair, his little body completely relaxed. I looked at each of them in turn, marveling at how far they had come. Lucy, who had been the start of it all. Scruff, who had been the first to join her. Jack, who had needed time and patience but had blossomed into a loyal friend. Millie, who had found her strength. Shadow, who had faced his past and come out stronger. And Titan, the newest member, who was already part of the family. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. This was home, not just for me, but for all of us. And no matter what came next, we would face it together. The sun had barely risen when I heard the faint rustle of paws on the porch. I stirred from my chair, still wrapped in the blanket I'd pulled close the night before. Outside, the frost glistened on the trees, the sky shifting from deep purple to pale orange. Jack and Shadow were already at the door, their tails wagging gently as they looked out into the yard. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside, the cold biting at my face. Titan was lying near the porch steps, his massive frame stretched out on the snow-covered wood. He lifted his head as I approached, his eyes calm and watchful. A few feet away, Tucker was already bouncing through the snow, his boundless energy turning the fresh drifts into tiny clouds of white. Lucy and Millie followed at a more measured pace, their tails wagging as they navigated the yard. "Looks like everyone's up early today," I said softly, scratching Titan behind the ears. He leaned into my touch for a moment, before sitting up, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. Shadow and Jack trotted down the steps, their noses low to the ground as they explored the frosty terrain. The pack had come together in ways I hadn't expected. Shadow had fully accepted Titan, and the two of them had become nearly inseparable. Jack, always the steady presence, kept peace among the group, while Lucy and Millie provided a sense of calm. Tucker, of course, brought the energy. It was a strange, perfect balance, each dog playing a role that seemed to fit them naturally. Mark's truck pulled up just as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the yard. He climbed out, his boots crunching in the snow, and carried a large bag of supplies toward the house. "Got some extra blankets and a few more collars," he said, setting the bag down on the porch. "Thought you might need them." "Thanks, Mark," I replied, helping him bring everything inside. "You've been a real lifesaver." He shrugged, grinning. "I figure I'm just a part of this story now." The dogs gathered around him, tails wagging and noses sniffing curiously at the new items. Titan stayed back, watching from a distance, but his posture was relaxed. Tucker tried to climb into the bag, his small body practically disappearing as he pawed at the blankets. Mark laughed, pulling Tucker out gently and ruffling his ears. "This one's got more energy than all the others combined." "Tell me about it," I said, shaking my head with a smile. "He never stops." The morning passed in a flurry of activity. The pack moved through their usual routine, a romp in the snow, followed by a warm meal inside. Titan had grown comfortable enough to eat near the others now, his guard slowly lowering. Shadow, ever patient, stayed close to him, their bond continuing to grow stronger. As I watched them, I thought again about what Mark had said a few days earlier. These dogs hadn't been planned, and yet their presence felt so natural. I hadn't chosen them. They had chosen me. And now, as I looked at the makeshift family we had become, I couldn't help but feel that everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and the temperature dropped, I decided to take a walk with the pack. The forest behind the house was quiet, the snow muffling the sound of our steps. Tucker darted ahead, his tail a blur as he explored every nook and cranny. Lucy and Millie walked side by side, their breath creating small clouds as they moved. Jack stayed close to my side, while Shadow and Titan trailed just behind, their presence a comforting weight. We followed the path through the trees, the silence broken only by the occasional crunch of snow or a soft bark from Tucker. It was a peaceful moment, a chance to breathe and take in the beauty of the world around us. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting a golden glow on the ground. I felt a deep sense of calm, as though everything in the world was exactly as it should be. As we returned to the house, the air began to turn colder, the promise of another snowy night in the wind. I prepared the fire, while the dogs settled into their usual spots. Titan stretched out near the door, his breathing slow and even. Shadow lay close to him, their bond evident in the way they mirrored each other's movements. Jack curled up beside the hearth, his eyes half closed as he relaxed. Lucy and Millie shared the blanket again, their heads resting on each other. Tucker, of course, had claimed his spot on the armchair, his tiny body already tucked into a ball. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the soft sound of the pack's breathing. They were my family now, each one a piece of a larger story that was still unfolding. And as I sat there, the warmth of the fire and the presence of the pack around me, I knew one thing for certain. We had all found our place. The next morning brought a strange stillness to the air. The wind had calmed, and the forest seemed almost hushed. I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee in hand, the heat from the mug warming my palms. The dogs were still inside, resting after a lively night. I glanced toward the trees, the snow glinting in the early light, and something caught my eye. A lone figure was moving through the woods, not far from the house. At first, I thought it might be another stray, perhaps a dog wandering in search of shelter. But as the figure grew closer, I realized it was a person. Bundled in a thick coat and scarf, they moved with slow, deliberate steps, as though they were searching for something. I set my coffee down and stepped off the porch, the crunch of snow beneath my boots breaking the silence. The figure paused, turning to face me. I raised a hand in greeting. "Hello? Can I help you?" They hesitated for a moment before continuing toward me. As they approached, I saw that it was an older man, his face weathered and kind. He stopped a few feet away, pulling down his scarf. "Morning," he said, his voice rough but friendly. "I'm sorry to bother you. I've been walking this area, hoping to find my dog." A pang of sympathy hit me. "Your dog? What kind of dog is it?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph. "She's a border collie, black and white. Been missing for about 2 weeks now. I heard there's a lot of dogs in this area, and I thought maybe she ended up around here." I shook my head gently. "I haven't seen a dog like that, but you're welcome to take a look around." He nodded, tucking the photo back into his pocket. "I'd appreciate that. I've been checking shelters and asking around town, but no one's seen her. She's my best friend. Never thought I'd lose her like this." The man's words lingered with me as I walked him toward the house. Inside, the dogs stirred, their curiosity piqued by the sound of footsteps. Lucy stood first, her tail wagging softly. Shadow and Titan watched from their spots, their eyes following the man as he stepped into the doorway. The man's expression softened as he saw them. "You've got quite the family here," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "They look happy." I smiled. "They are. They've all come here one way or another, looking for something." He crouched down, letting Lucy sniff his hand. "You've given them a good home. That's something special." As the man walked through the house, the dogs followed him curiously. Tucker, ever bold, darted forward to sniff at his boots. Millie stayed close to Lucy, her watchful eyes tracking his every move. Shadow and Titan hung back, their presence calm, but attentive. When the man stepped back outside, he turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "I'll keep looking," he said, "but I can tell you've got a good heart. If I can't find her, at least I know she might have found someone like you." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "I hope you find her," I said, "and if you need help, let me know." As he walked back into the woods, I stood on the porch, watching until he disappeared among the trees. The dogs gathered around me, their warmth a silent reassurance. I knelt down, scratching Lucy behind the ears. "Let's keep an eye out for her, okay?" Lucy wagged her tail, her bright eyes meeting mine. Shadow moved closer, his nose nudging my arm as if to agree. Titan stood tall, his steady presence a comfort. I didn't know if the man would find his dog, but I did know that if she ever wandered our way, she would find a home here, just like the rest of them. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls as the pack settled into their usual spots for the night. The warmth of the flames kept the cold winter air at bay, and the sound of steady, contented breathing filled the room. I leaned back in my chair, watching as Jack and Shadow curled up together near the door, their bond as unshakable as ever. Titan lay stretched out beside them, his presence solid and calm. Lucy, always the matriarch, rested near the hearth with Millie tucked close beside her. Tucker had claimed his favorite spot on the armchair, his tiny form nestled into the cushions. They were all here, safe and sound, and for a moment the world felt complete. But I couldn't shake the thought of the man who had come by earlier. His weathered face and hopeful eyes stayed with me, and I found myself wondering if he'd find his dog. The idea of losing one of these dogs, of not knowing where they were or if they were safe, sent a pang through my chest. I glanced down at Lucy, her gentle eyes meeting mine, and gave her a soft smile. "We'll keep looking," I murmured. And if she comes this way, we'll make sure she's okay." Lucy wagged her tail, a small but reassuring gesture. I knew I couldn't do much, but I could keep my eyes open. I could keep hope alive. As the days passed, life settled back into its familiar rhythm. The pack roamed the yard, their tracks crisscrossing the snow in a web of joyful chaos. Tucker remained the fearless explorer, while Jack and Shadow patrolled the perimeter with a quiet confidence. Titan often stood watch, his massive frame a comforting presence. Lucy and Millie followed their own pace, content to keep an eye on the younger ones while basking in the winter sun. Mark stopped by often, his visits now a regular part of our routine. He'd bring supplies, share a cup of coffee, and update me on anything he'd heard from the local shelters. "No word on that border collie yet," he said one morning, his tone tinged with disappointment. "But I'll keep checking." I nodded, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. "Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it." He glanced out the window, watching as Titan nudged a stick toward Shadow, inviting him to play. "They've really come together, haven't they?" he said. "Yeah," I replied, following his gaze. "They're a family now." Mark smiled. "Well, if anyone can give that missing dog a good home, it's you." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. I didn't feel like I was doing anything extraordinary. I had just opened my door. They had done the rest. The nights grew longer, and the snow piled higher. The pack adapted easily, their thick coats protecting them from the chill. I made sure the house was always warm, the fire always burning. And every evening, as we all gathered around the hearth, I felt a sense of peace that was hard to put into words. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I noticed Shadow behaving differently. He had always been calm, patient, and steady. But now he seemed restless. His ears twitched at every sound outside, and he kept glancing toward the window. Titan, ever attentive, mirrored Shadow's unease, his eyes following the same invisible trail. I set my book down and leaned forward. "What is it, boy?" I asked softly. Shadow didn't move for a moment, but then he stood and walked to the door. He let out a low, questioning whine. Jack joined him, their noses pressed to the crack beneath the doorframe. Titan followed, his massive frame tense. I felt a prickle of concern. The dogs were rarely this alert without reason. I stood and opened the door, stepping out into the cold. The night was quiet, the snow untouched. The only sound was the faint rustle of the trees in the wind. I scanned the yard, my breath visible in the freezing air. And then I saw it. A small shape at the edge of the trees. It moved slowly, cautiously, as if unsure of its surroundings. I squinted, trying to make out details. It wasn't one of mine. The fur was black and white, the shape smaller and more delicate. "Shadow." "Stay," I said firmly, though he was already at my side. The others hung back, watching. I took a step forward, then another. The shape froze, its head turning toward me. As it moved closer to the light spilling from the house, I saw it clearly. A border collie, just like the man's photograph. I stopped a few feet away, lowering myself to a crouch. "Hey there," I called softly. "It's okay. You're safe here." The dog hesitated, her body trembling. She looked exhausted, her coat matted with snow and dirt. But her eyes, bright, intelligent, and full of fear, locked onto mine. "Come on," I coaxed. "You're okay." It felt like forever, but finally she took a tentative step toward me, then another. I stayed as still as possible, my hand outstretched. When she was close enough, she sniffed my fingers, her nose cold against my skin. I moved slowly, brushing a bit of snow from her fur. "There you go," I murmured. "You're all right now." Shadow stood a few paces back, watching intently. Titan stayed beside him, his presence steady. The rest of the pack had gathered near the door, their eyes on the new arrival. I stood slowly, careful not to startle her. "Come on," I said gently, stepping backward toward the house. She followed hesitantly, her steps unsteady. When we reached the porch, the others stayed back, giving her space. She stopped at the threshold, glancing nervously at the pack. "It's okay," I said, stepping inside and kneeling down. I patted the floor beside me, and after a long moment she stepped into the house. Lucy was the first to approach, her tail wagging gently. She gave the collie a soft nuzzle, her calming presence setting the tone for the others. One by one, the pack moved closer, sniffing and wagging their tails. Shadow stayed back, his eyes thoughtful. Titan lowered his head in a gesture of welcome. The collie stood still, her eyes darting from one dog to the next. But when she looked back at me, her body relaxed slightly. She had chosen to trust me. And in that moment, I knew that this was the dog the man had been searching for. As the pack settled back into their spots, I reached for my phone. I dialed the number the man had given me, my heart pounding as it rang. When he answered, his voice was tired but hopeful. "I think I found her," I said. The pause on the other end of the line was filled with disbelief. "You found my girl?" "I think so," I said. "Black and white border collie, right?" "Yes," he said, his voice shaking. "That's her." "Come by tomorrow," I said. "She's safe now." When I hung up, I looked at the collie lying near the hearth, her body finally relaxed. Shadow lay nearby, his watchful gaze still fixed on her. Titan was at his side, a steady presence as always. For now, she was home. And tomorrow, she would be reunited with the man who had been searching for her all this time. I leaned back against the wall, listening to the soft sound of breathing and the crackling fire. For a moment, the world was still, the warmth of the pack surrounding me. It wasn't an ending. It was just another chapter in our unfolding story. The morning came quietly, the sky overcast and heavy with the promise of more snow. The pack stirred from their spots one by one. Lucy stretched first, shaking the warmth of sleep from her fur, while Tucker bounded up to her with his usual puppy energy. Jack, ever steady, rose next, his dark eyes scanning the room as if taking stock of everyone's well-being. Titan stood last, his massive frame moving with the careful grace that always seemed so at odds with his size. I made my way to the kitchen, the sound of paws following close behind. The routine was the same as it had been for weeks now. Food bowls filled, fresh water poured, and warm oatmeal cooked for myself. Shadow stayed by the window, his gaze fixed on the snowy woods outside. He had been quiet since the collie arrived, though not withdrawn. It was as if he was reflecting, considering something that only he understood. The collie, meanwhile, had adjusted quickly to the house. She followed Lucy's lead, growing more confident each day, though her eyes still held a cautious edge. It was a look I had seen before, the look of a dog that had seen both kindness and hardship, and wasn't yet sure which one to trust. The man would be arriving soon. I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me felt a twinge of hesitation, a reluctance to see the collie leave just as she was starting to settle, but I knew she wasn't mine to keep. She had a home waiting for her, someone who had never given up on finding her. That was a bond I couldn't stand in the way of. The knock came right on time. The dogs went on high alert, their ears perking up. Lucy barked once, a calm, measured sound, before standing by the door. I opened it to find the man standing there, his coat dusted with fresh snow, his face lined with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Morning," I said, stepping back to let him in. He entered slowly, his eyes sweeping over the room until they landed on her. The collie had risen from her spot by the fire, her body still but her eyes wide, focused on the man. She didn't run to him, but she didn't back away either. She just watched. "Luna," the man said, his voice cracking. "It's me, girl." The name struck a chord. Her ears twitched, and she took a hesitant step forward, then another. The man crouched down, holding out his hand, and I saw it. The moment recognition hit her. Her body seemed to melt into motion, her tail wagging furiously as she closed the distance between them. She pressed her head against his chest, her whole body quivering with excitement and relief. He wrapped his arms around her, his face buried in her fur. I felt a lump in my throat as I watched. It was a reunion that spoke of years spent together, a bond that hadn't faded even after time and distance. The pack watched too, their heads tilted as if they understood the significance of what they were seeing. Shadow sat quietly beside Titan, his gaze never leaving the pair. "She's been safe here," I said after a moment, breaking the quiet. "She's a good dog." The man looked up, his eyes glistening. "Thank you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm just glad she found her way back." The man stood, Luna staying close at his side. "She's had a rough time, hasn't she?" he asked, his hand never leaving her fur. "She was scared when she first showed up," I said. "But she's strong. She's found her footing here." The man's hand stilled, his eyes meeting mine. "You've done more than just keep her safe. You've given her a place to heal." I didn't know what to say to that. I looked at Luna, now leaning into him with her eyes half closed, and felt a pang of both sadness and joy. She had been part of our story for only a short time, but it was clear she belonged to another chapter. "She's home now," I said finally. The man nodded, his expression one of deep gratitude. "You've got a special thing here," he said, glancing around at the other dogs. "They all look so happy." "They are," I said simply. "And they're family." Luna wagged her tail, her gaze shifting between the man and me. It was as if she was saying goodbye in her own way, a quiet thank you for the refuge she had been given. As they left, the pack followed them to the door, watching as the man and Luna disappeared into the snowy morning. The house felt quieter, a space left behind by her absence, but there was no regret. She was where she needed to be. The rest of the day passed in the familiar rhythm. The pack played in the snow, their tracks weaving a tapestry across the yard. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the house felt as warm as ever. I watched them all, Lucy's calm leadership, Scruff's playful energy, Jack's steady presence, Millie's gentle watchfulness, Tucker's boundless enthusiasm, Titan's quiet strength, and Shadow's thoughtful, reflective nature. Each of them had come here for a reason, and each had found a place where they belonged. As the sun set and the sky turned to a deep indigo, I sat by the fire. The pack settled around me. Shadow rested near my feet, his eyes half closed. Titan lay stretched out, his breathing steady and calm. Lucy and Millie shared their usual blanket, while Tucker had claimed his armchair once again. The house was peaceful, the air filled with the soft sounds of the pack's breathing and the gentle crackle of the fire. It was a moment of quiet contentment, a reminder of how far we had all come. I leaned back, my hand resting on Shadow's head, and let out a long, slow breath. We were here, we were together, and that was enough.